I was there physically, but I was having an experience where I was observing myself thinking, I can't have these conversations anymore. I just literally couldn't. And it wasn't even a choice at that point. It was almost like a decision. And I got home from Vegas. I called my boss and I said, I'm really sorry, but I'm resigning.
This is Second Calling, and my name is Bradley Wright. Today's guest is Eileen Crossin. Eileen spent her career in marketing and advertising with stops at TikTok and the C-suite. But she left that. She left that to build something, well, very different. If your career looks successful on the outside, but it no longer feels right on the inside, this conversation's for you. So welcome to the show, Eileen. It's a pleasure to have you.
Why, thank you, Bradley. It is a pleasure to be here.
And Eileen and I have worked together in offering purpose training. So we've had many hours of conversations about purpose. So she very kindly offered to help me relaunch the podcast with this new episode. So let's just get right to it. Talk to us about an inflection point that you had in your career where you thought, this may not be where I want to be, and I may need something else.
I love this question. But first, might I say, thank you for having me. And you were very kind to suggest that you invited me. And I'm fairly certain that I invited myself by telling you that I wanted to be your first guest. And so I appreciate you honoring that. And it's very exciting to be here. For those of you who don't know, I am a very big fan of Bradley's work. And if you've been following me for any period of time, you do know that because I talk about him often in my socials. So it is a pleasure and thank you. And the answer to your question is not necessarily the most succinct, here's how it happened. Here's my aha moment. Here's how I tie it up in a bow and serve it neatly to you, dear audience, though I will do my best. I'm writing a book, and in the book, there is a part where I actually created a tombstone for my corporate self. Here lies Eileen Crossin, corporate Eileen Crossin, 2004 to 2025. So I've contemplated this quite a lot. And essentially, I spent the majority of my career in media. I worked in advertising for a variety of different types of publishers, from physical marketing to digital marketing. And the most notable company that I worked for that the listeners would be familiar with is TikTok. And I had a very interesting moment, probably in about 2015, I would say, where I worked for this incredible seasoned executive who was the most people-oriented people leader I'd ever worked for. And so in getting to know her and in wanting to impress her, I spent a lot of time studying her, as I guess I generally do with people. And she was very fascinated by mindset. Now, I was in revenue leadership, and so I was always looking for tools that would help sales teams, so revenue leadership, leading sales teams for advertising and media companies. And I was always looking for tools to help sales teams optimize their business performance. And so I learned through this leader about the power of mindset and how you can choose your perspective. And I'd never studied or understood this before as a sort of behavior of the brain or as something that was an option for me. I always just sort of had it. And it worked for me, and it was one of the reasons that I was successful, but it was all very unconscious. So I started to study it, and I became obsessed with it, and I infused it into a lot of my work, and it started to become the lever that I would offer to my teams as the way to be successful in sales, in advertising sales. And I then went to a much larger company, TikTok, and had these grandiose visions of the company having resources beyond my wildest dreams to train sellers in how to work with their minds and how to use mindset as a performance tool, as I had now come to see as a standard or as something that was like a best practice that all corporate learning and development should offer. And no such thing existed. And what I started to discover and started to create was my own work. And simultaneously, I was being trained to teach meditation. And that was obviously outside of my corporate day-to-day. Sadly, it'd be nice if it were trained inside. I think it could be very valuable. That's for another day. And what I realized was mindset is a choice we can make, but only when we have the awareness to make that choice. And so as I was studying mindfulness, which was really the core component of the meditation training I was doing, I started to think about the combination of awareness and choice, mindfulness and mindset. And I started to use that in my practices as a leader working with my team at TikTok. And I started to see the effect it was having, and especially with high performers who wanted to go further. And so I thought, wow, I really have something with this. And I'm offering a tool and a program that leaders really need, but that they're not thinking about. Because in my experience, most training, quote unquote, was really about skills and knowledge acquisition. But I saw how teams got really blocked and limited in their thinking and let their thoughts decide their possibilities and their futures, and how that was a limitation on performance. So I decided to build it myself, and I called it the Momentum Method. And then I decided to leave TikTok and build a whole company around it. I did that for about 6 months. And then I was like, wow, building a company is really hard. And also, decision makers want to buy what they've always bought, and trying to sell them, my friend used to call it a Swiffer, when they just want to buy a mop, is hard. And so this was sort of pre-AI. And so I ended up getting swallowed up in one of the firms that I was consulting for, and taking another turn at revenue leadership at a higher level and in the C-suite this time, and thought, well, this is it. This is finally the penultimate for me in my career. And suffice it to say, it was not. And I was sitting at an industry conference that's pretty famous in the ad world in Las Vegas in January of 2025. And I was having a conversation with a lovely gentleman, which was a conversation I had had with so many like him or her in the years before. It was about a partnership and about creating a deal structure and about how we might structure it so that it was mutually beneficial, and all the things you might contemplate in that sort of a conversation. And I had this out-of-body experience. So I'll finally arrive at the inflection point that you asked me about 12 minutes ago, which essentially was I was there physically, but I was having an experience where I was observing myself thinking, I can't have these conversations anymore. I just literally couldn't. And it wasn't even a choice at that point. It was almost like a decision. And I got home from Vegas. I called my boss and I said, I'm really sorry, but I'm resigning. And since then, I have been working on building a company called Quantum Potential to teach people how to think differently to create change. In the beginning, like I said, it was really all about revenue teams and a performance tool. And now in the AI era, it's for everyone and everything, because we all need to understand how to adapt in this current day, in this current environment. And it offers the skills to teach people how to do that.
Wow. There's a lot going on here. How interesting. There's a couple things I didn't know. I mean, we've talked about some of this before, but it's nice to hear the fuller, richer story.
Thank you.
So at first glance, I'm struck by how what started off as a work tool built itself up, gained momentum, and eventually took you out of the work. And then when you went back into the regular work, it's almost like it just pulled you out forcibly. So it's
yes.
So it's not the case where you had a job and you're driving down the road, but you looked out the window at some pasture and you thought, oh, it'd be nice to be over there.
Yeah.
it's you're almost something within work took you outside of work. And that's a really interesting compulsion for or a really interesting mechanism for the change. So let's backtrack a little bit here. First of all, meditation. So I've meditated for decades, love it, but I've never thought of becoming a trainer, and I probably still won't. Why did you get into training? What was the impulse there?
I am a student of life to the fullest, almost to a fault. And when I find something I like or something that works, I become obsessed and I try and go as far into it as I possibly can.
Okay.
And I found meditation. My father was diagnosed with a terminal brain condition in 2014. And at the time, I didn't really have any healthy habits to manage my stress and my anxiety. And I worked in a pretty high pressure environment and I lived a pretty high functioning life. And I did it with a lot more like grit and force than I did with like ease and flow. And I decided when he got sick that I was going to need a tool to support me. And the tools that I had to support me weren't the healthiest tools. So I started meditating and I found it to be the most effective way to support my stress and anxiety and my grief and my sadness and all the emotions that came along with it. And it stuck with me really, I mean, now forever, but it became something that was really my survival mechanism. And so I knew that it was something that had a tremendous amount of depth and dimension. And when I studied meditation in Austin, and part of it was looking for community because I had just moved there and I'd started to deepen my spiritual practices and really didn't have anyone to connect with on that level. And so part of it was actually looking for community in that space. And I got far more than I bargained for, which is, I don't know, maybe an interesting conversation or maybe a diversion. But I started studying it as a way to support myself. And actually it became a huge component of my work because I believe it's everything. Like I think we think about meditation in moments. We think about it on a cushion. We think about it as a practice. We think about it as a thing we do and check off the list and that we have to be good at or not good at. I think all of that is bullshit. And I think it's really about a practice of presence and awareness. And that is, to me, sort of the table stakes of being able to function. I won't even say perform. I would say function in a very distracted, very disrupted, very fear-based world. So it's become, to me, the most sort of fundamental part of not only my work, but really ultimately how I live.
I'm struck by how, yet again, a tool that you developed for work ended up taking you out of work, ended up being very significant for you. Now, for meditation, it was also about your father, and you have my condolences. You and he were too young to have him die.
Yes.
And I'm sorry for that.
Thank you.
You got into reframing, learning about reframes. Because of a boss you worked with. And then part of the appeal of meditation was helping you to cope with what is clearly a very stressful job in the corporate setting. Now let's go to your time in Las Vegas. Have you had a lot of experiences like that where you're just observing yourself from the outside and it's almost like you act beyond volition?
Yeah. Since then, I think that was the first probably of many that came in that year, because I think the inflection point was really a period of transformation. And I made a lot of decisions during that time that weren't necessarily logical and weren't necessarily responsible and weren't the ones I would have thought I would have made. But it was almost like, I was having this experience of observing my life and watching myself do it as a part of some greater plan that I was unaware of, but carrying out.
That fits with the meditation, the spirituality emphasis of kind of navigating the world in ways other than just kind of spreadsheet rationality.
Yes.
Do you have any regrets with the transition? When you look back, are there any things you wish you'd done differently? Like, do you wish that you had been able to stay out of corporate before you TikTok and instead of having to go back? Or no, I guess after TikTok without having to go back into it? Or if you had to do it again and you could, how would you do it differently?
But I kind of don't believe in regrets, and I think everything is a lesson. And what I realized having gone back the second time is that I had a pattern, and the pattern needed to be interrupted. And the pattern was that when I had fear or when I didn't trust myself, I would want to be saved. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that that's unusual necessarily. I don't know if we have the awareness either necessarily while it's happening, but it had to happen because I needed to recognize that pattern so that I had greater clarity of how I make decisions now and going forward. I made the decision in a very insulated or insular way. And I have a husband of now 15 years, and I didn't consult him on my decision before making it. And I was so caught up in the emotion of how I felt, which created that force to move me. And I'm not sure I could have done it any other way. But in retrospect, I wish I had healthier communication tools to support me and to support us so that I could have had that conversation versus making it in a very singular fashion when I'm not a singular person. I have a partner and a child. And I think that if I could go back and do anything differently, it would have been to work harder at better communication around what I needed in that moment. And it may not have changed the outcome, but at least it would have changed how I would have approached it in a very important relationship.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate your vulnerability with that. And I get it. I do variations of that routinely with my wife and other family members. For me, it's almost as if I work so hard to overcome the internal resistance in making a big change in my life that any additional external resistance just seems overwhelming. So it's like, no, I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
And I've made some pretty big choices where my wife will find out and she'll be like, you just did what? It's like, that really impacts both of us. The expression we give it is unilateral decisions with bilateral consequences. And
perfect. Exactly that.
Done that quite a bit. So that raises an interesting point that when we think of purpose and when we think of, following what matters most to us, we naturally gravitate towards ourselves and inside, and rightfully so. But there is often another person component. And, whether it's just an FYI or can you support me, or you can give input, or how can we do this together?
Yeah.
Those are very much lessons that I'm trying to learn myself. I appreciate the nonlinearity of your journey, and that seems to be pretty typical. So we offer workshops on purpose, and one of the points that we leave them with 2 or 3 points of like, okay, before you go, just here's what to expect. And one of them is that it's going to be a nonlinear process. So we want our futures to be from point A to point B. So sort of like driving on an interstate across the Midwest, where you go from one major city to another major city. But what ends up happening is that instead we see some beautiful flowers and we pull over and we pick and we smell the flowers, and then we take a detour and go have lunch 20 miles off the road because we hear there's a good place. Then the car breaks down, and then we stay somewhere for 3 months because it looks like a great place, and then we get lost and drive backwards, and then we have to turn around, and eventually we get somewhere where we want to be, and then eventually we get someplace that wasn't where we headed out to go to, but we like it a lot better, and it takes longer, and so forth. And so we always have to warn our workshop participants that if that happens, you're not doing something wrong. And to sort of back off the super efficiency, I've made the decision, now let's just implement it perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, I am like, I hear you offer option A of getting from point A to B, and then I hear you offer option B of ending up living somewhere that you found accidentally. If you're listening, I just did air quotes. And I mean, the thought of going from point A to point B makes me like nervous and sweaty. And the thought of like getting to live somewhere for 3 years by happenstance is like the joy to me of living. We've talked about this a lot. The book, The Surrender Experiment, yes, by Michael Singer was sort of my first foray into understanding living this way. And I probably only read it maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. And I was like, wait, hold on. This is an option? Because I think you get so programmed to get from A to B to C to D, because it's like from the moment you enter the education system, it's like you're on a treadmill.
Yes.
And then when you exit the education system, it's what do you want to be? What's your career? And then at that point, the identity foreclosure begins and you just continue to become that person until the point where you have so many responsibilities and obligations and so much programming around who that person is, that your opportunity to see yourself through any other lens is not clear and scary for some. And I think the alternative is even scarier. The book that I'm writing is called Unrealized. Mm-hmm. And it's all about living nonlinearly as a way to discover self, which is essentially what we're here to do, if you ask me, and probably a really nice connection and correlation to purpose, because that's a very significant component to self. So yeah, not linear by choice, by command, by like any means possible to avoid falling into the trap of living by someone else's design.
I'm glad you brought up Michael Singer's book. On my website, I have a list of like 12 books that I recommend for if you want to find purpose on your own. And it is one of them. It just hit me so hard. I think I've read it 2 or 3 times, and it's very rare for me to read a book a second time. And if you haven't read it, obviously this is a big plug from both of us to read it.
Yeah.
What struck me is that he managed a tension between surrendering direction, but yet giving his all into getting there.
Yes.
And so before I read this book, I thought of surrender as sort of couch and Cheetos model of living, where you're like, I'm just going to, sit on the couch and just wait for life to unfold before me, the magic of life, or something like that. And Michael Singer, if you haven't read the book, ended up being either CEO or COO or some C something of WebMD. So he created a company that got bought, and he ended up cashing out for like $250 million. Like, he did very well for himself. I am pretty sure that you don't have that kind of job without working really hard. And the basis of everything he did is that he created a software program for medical offices that was better than any other program for billing and patient management and stuff like that. Now, you can't have a program like that without spending lots of time working. So on one hand, he was very diligent and a very hard worker. On the other hand, he completely surrendered direction. So it's almost like in his language, like he let the universe decide what he would do next. And he was almost just indifferent to the direction. And so those two tensions constantly go back and forth to me, those two tensions, the tension between, I guess, those two ideas is something I'm constantly trying to calibrate and figure out where I want it to be.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And I've actually been thinking about this a lot in my own practice and my own life, because I do think you can go too far in either direction pretty easily. I would say in terms of, though, your surrender as being Cheetos and a couch, I actually think surrendering is much harder
Yeah.
than we think. Because if you're going to trust beyond what you can see, which is essentially what Michael Singer did and how I think we both strive to live, that takes a lot of guts. And it takes a very, very, very clear connection to self and a trust muscle that constantly needs to be honed and developed. But I think it's that same sort of idea of not living linearly, in that there is sort of no such thing as A to B. It's like it's just not that simple, right? Yeah. There are so many variables and there are so many options and there are so many timelines. But I think for me, the way that I sort of rationalize it is, as long as I'm coming back to the most authentic version of myself, that's how I can find surrender. And I think that even that terminology, authentic version of self, is like so loaded and has so much baggage. And I've been trying to think about another way to talk about that. But it's really like your truth, right? And I think for him, and even for me, when I'm working a lot on stuff that matters, on stuff that I love, on stuff that energizes me, on stuff that lights me up, it doesn't feel like work. It doesn't feel like effort. It doesn't feel hard. It also represents the truest version of me. And so I think that that's maybe where the tension is eased, is when you're in that flow state because you're in your truest essence.
I like that. So in terms of surrender, you're not surrendering to kind of random impulses of the universe or random circumstances. Rather, you're trying to surrender to what matters most to you. And that is, we can call it the authentic version of the self. But then when we do make that surrender, it involves a lot of effort because it wants something. It wants to go somewhere, do something, change things or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, backing up a little bit, or I guess zooming out, I'm struck by what an interesting puzzle or phenomenon purpose is, because it incorporates so many levels of explanation. So we've talked about spirituality. We've talked a lot about the self. And then there's a big circumstances of your life component. And then there's other people. So in your life, there's things that you wanted. There's your spirituality that you started developing more in Austin. There were circumstances you had, like the interaction with the guy at Las Vegas and your job. And then there were relationships, the people you got to know through your meditation center and also with your husband. The purpose comes out of all of these. It's never just one of them. And so as a sociologist, or I guess just as an academic researcher, we're used to looking at life at sort of one level and just focusing on one being. So psychologists will focus on the self, sociologists, society, and so forth. But purpose is always a story that crosses levels and mixes it up. Before we continue, a quick note. I write a monthly newsletter for people trying to figure out what comes next in work and life. Every issue gives you a story, an idea, and a practical next step that you can take to live with greater purpose. You can subscribe to it and learn more about my work at my website, bradleywrightphd.com. Now, back to the conversation. Okay, so you are where you are now. What do you like best about your career and what you're doing now?
That is such a good question, because I have become very focused on this idea of surrendering to life as sort of the ultimate revelation of self. There is nothing that reveals the self more than running your own business. And all of the parts of yourself that are triggered and that are made vulnerable and that are exposed and that are seen and that are challenged. And so I've learned a tremendous amount about myself and about what matters to me, and about what I offer to the world. And I think I would have told you prior to doing this that I offered people like the coaching or the advice or the training to be better at their work, right? Or be better at their life. And I think to an extent, that still is a promise that the work that I do offers, but I think it's gone far beyond that. And what I see now is I offer people a way to see their truest, most authentic version. And I think that's a really great gift to give to people, is to be seen as their true self. And so I think that's the North Star for everything that I do, whether it's our work together in the purpose realm or the mind training work that I do. It's really all about giving people space to become who they truly are. And that matters so much to me. And I think that matters so much to the world. And to be able to do that every day is like beyond my wildest dreams of what was possible.
That's a great observation about starting your own business and becoming yourself.
Yeah.
And I'd never thought of it before. But when you have a job where you're told what to do most of the time, you don't have to bring yourself. You can just perform, and then you have the self on the nights and the weekends. But when you have a job like you have, and it's a situation where with everything that you do, it flows out of, well, what do you want? And then if you're trying to root that in the self rather than just ambition or expectations or norms or something, then it's almost a constant purpose challenge of building the business. And not just what will it be about, but how will you structure it? What time will you give it?
Yeah.
How will you use your resources? How do you incorporate other people? So every aspect of starting a business is really a purpose puzzle if you're doing it the way you are. I was also struck by how all of this started in your workplace. So you're moving along with your work, and then you're being successful, and you're moving up the ranks, and you learn about reframes, cognitive reframes. And then later you come across meditation, in part in response to need of work. Those took you out of your career. Now you're working with other people in the context of their careers to give it to them. So it's almost, these things, it's almost like they wanted to take you out of your career so that they can get into other people's careers, as it were. And I'm not necessarily assigning any agency with that, but that's the pattern. It's as if that were the case. Now, since you work with other people and help them to engage their authentic selves and so forth, let me ask you a question that I am unclear about. And this is something I actually think about a lot. A thing with purpose is that we help people become who they are rather than telling them who they are or giving them instructions or orders. And yet we run into people's resistance or limitations or fear and so forth. So if in your work you had a magic wand where you could just wave it over anybody and anything could happen for them. Now, the life is a journey answer is you wouldn't want the magic wand. If you were to do that, if you could speed up the process or give somebody something new, what would it be? And I want to hear your answer. And then when you're done, I'll give you what I think my answer is.
Okay. This is very fresh in my mind because I've been thinking about this rather obsessively myself. So we should compare some notes offline too. I think that part of this conditioning, programming, treadmill, whatever we want to call it, of how you sort of get to the inflection point is thinking about this constant idea of becoming, right? And there is a version of realizing who you are, phase after phase, success after success, misstep after misstep. However, the thinking that I've been working with and that feels really resonant to me is it's not about becoming, it's about remembering.
Oh, interesting.
And so the language that you use is becoming who you are, right? Our purpose work helps people become who they are. But if you think about the model that you offer and what actually happens in that room, whether it's looking at what you wanted to be when you were a child, looking at your intuition. That's not about becoming into someone or something else. That's about remembering who you were to begin with before the world told you, right? And so oftentimes, I know you suggest in purpose work to look at what you wanted to be when you were a child, right? That has a lot of inclination, and design your life. And a lot of programs like it suggest that you look for information in that phase. And I think part of remembering who you are goes back to, or is really about stripping away who you've become to remember who you are.
That makes a connection for me between two things that are important that I'd never connected before. One, I mean, what you're talking about is something that we've talked about and is part of our program, and that sometimes purpose is behind us and we have to rediscover it, and rather than find something brand new we've never encountered. The other is I value Jungian psychology quite a bit, and one of the core themes there is the shadow self. And the idea is that we start off life as kids, as little guys, and our parents, our siblings, our friends, society tells us there's all these things we can't do, and probably for the best. And as a result, we just sort of hide them away and we ignore that they exist. And we're too scared to admit they exist. And so what Jungian psychologists call shadow work is basically excavating that and allowing for things that society may disapprove of, may think as scandalous, may find as reprehensible, are just part of who you are. Not that you enact it, not that you give permission to it, but that you sort of reintegrate it back into who you are. Because I think Jung said that when you do that, even though they're bad things, quote unquote, he said they're like 95% good to reintegrate. And so I went through a phase where I spent a lot of time doing shadow kind of reintegration. And I'd never thought of that in terms of purpose language of, becoming who I am. It's almost as if that's like at a deeper, like almost at an operating system level of who we are at a very basic level, and then moving forward to it with it into the circumstances of our life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's more important now than ever because the circumstances of our life are changing, right? I think the environment around us is unlike any we've ever experienced. And you can think about that through a variety of lenses. But I do believe that it calls for, and we certainly won't get into the debate of humans versus AI here, but my opinion and observation and hypothesis is that this moment really calls for us to remember that version, because that's the version that will be your guide for how we evolve as humans, because the corporate structure, or I'll take it out of corporate, the institutional structures or paradigms that we've all been living in are changing.
Yes. And you layer upon that electronic distraction. We now have the capacity to never be bored, to have something going on. I see that here on campus when I walk around. I mean, there are kids who, they have their AirPods in, their ear things, like all the time. So if you want to talk to them, you have to sort of get their attention. They take it out. And I actually had a group of students where I had them look up how much they use their phones on screen time. And I mean, the average is very high. It's 5 to 10 hours routinely. And it's very rare for people to be below 5. One kid had it like 22 hours. And he said, I sleep with them in. Like, I just always have them in. And, he sleeps listening to things or whatever. And that has a number of impacts that people have talked about. But one of them is it takes away some of the space we need for engaging ourselves. So I guess if I had a magic wand, what I would do would be to somehow accelerate people's appetite and motivation for purpose. I encounter people, and this is somewhat autobiographical, who realize the need for purpose in the middle of their life or later of their life, and late stages of their life, and by then, a lot of their life has already gone by. And they look back and they do have regrets. And they do think things differently. And so when I work with people, especially young people, I find myself wishing it's like, hurry up and realize how important this is, because you're going to later, and the sooner you do it, the better.
Yeah.
Having said that, every once in a while I'll work with people who are in their 20s or 30s, which for me is a young person, and they get purpose. And it's just so joyful to think, oh, you can orient the rest of your life around what matters most.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think, and this is maybe an overly optimistic view, given the example that you shared about the gentleman who sleeps with his AirPods in, but this generation of younger people, as we're calling them, won't enter the same workforce that we did, or won't enter the same economy that we did, and they'll have to think differently. And ideally that leaves room for choice that then lends itself to work like purpose work. That'd be my eternal optimist perspective. I don't know if that's the trend necessarily, but that's our opportunity for sure.
You're absolutely right. So the traditional model of work is you pick which starting lane you start the race in, and then you have the
or
race.
Someone picks it for you.
Yeah. And then it's laid out before you, and your job is just to run it. And I hear young people bemoan that that's not the case anymore, that you don't have that stability and security. And I get that. But there is an upside. That ties into something that came up in a conversation earlier this week. I was talking to two psychologists, and we're talking about the possibility of taking purpose training into an inpatient mental hospital. And they said that they have a fair number of young people, or a number of their clientele are young people who can't, they're paralyzed by moving forward into adulthood. It's just completely overwhelming. And I think part of the story ties into what you're talking about in terms of the way society is structured now. We just have so many choices, and they're so consequential that we can't just pick a starting line and go.
Yes. And it also leads us to another opportunity, which is, and this is obviously not the outsized case of being in an inpatient mental health facility, right? This is sort of more general societal. The opportunity to understand how your brain works and that its fundamental reason for being is to help you survive, but that oftentimes it perceives new and unfamiliar and different and uncertain as a threat.
Yeah.
As opposed to discomfort, and what sort of just that understanding offers in terms of creating choice instead of fear. I think the other thing that I feel hopeful about is how nervous system regulation has become part of the zeitgeist, because I think what starts as dysregulation of the nervous system and ends up as chronic stress or anxiety, if more tools were offered, especially in educational institutions for children to help regulate the nervous system, could also support a lot of the mental health challenges being faced. And again, this is not the sort of outsized cases, which I don't dismiss at all, but it's just to say, generally, I have taught my son, he's 8 years old, how to breathe properly. And now I observe when he gets overwhelmed, he will stop and he'll go, and I swear that if I teach him nothing else for the rest of his life, I'm good. Because I think that one little habit can change someone's life, remembering to breathe, right?
That's wise. Another, I don't want to sound like a cranky old guy talking about young people today. Those young people, although
we know you're not, Bradley.
Another benefit that young people have today is there's so much more openness and awareness and sophistication talking about mental health and things that go on inside of us. I think when I was growing up, nobody had ADHD, nobody had autism, nobody had anxiety or depression. And if people were different than you, they were weird to be mocked, if not bullied. That was sort of the way things worked. And listening to the stories from my father and other people of his generation, it was far more the case, in the 40s and 50s and so forth. And so I think that's a big plus.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I live in Brooklyn, so I'm in the epicenter of different as the norm, I think. or unique, I'll say. I won't even say different, unique. Though I also think it's important to acknowledge that that understanding can become counterproductive because there are teenagers that I've spent time with who are so quick to label themselves as anxious or stressed or OCD. And it is not to suggest that they are not any of the above, but I am a firm believer in language becoming reality. And I think experiencing a moment of stress or experiencing a moment of anxiety is different than I am an anxious person. And the more you think I am an anxious person, the more you become it. So I think there is probably just like a scale that maybe has to be monitored so it doesn't tip, so that all of that awareness and openness doesn't contribute to more of the problem.
And that ties in with your earlier thoughts about reframing. That if we say, I am a blank, we're reframing the situation, maybe not in ways that we want.
Yeah. I mean, I think anytime you are. And so you're immediately creating a construct around yourself, which then your brain will look for evidence to continue to prove.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There was a study years ago, decades ago, where researchers went to some elementary school teachers and they said, we've developed a way of measuring latent talent, and we're able to identify young people, and this is like elementary school. This is done in elementary schools. We're able to identify kids who are ready to bloom and really blossom, really take off. They just have this latent talent ready to express itself. Here's a list of kids in your class. They came back a year later or at the end of the year, and sure enough, those kids had really taken off. And they got better grades, they were better liked, et cetera, et cetera. Well, as you would anticipate, the names of the kids on that list were randomly drawn and just showed the power of the teacher's expectations. How much more so than we have our own expectations.
Yeah. It's so important. And so many of these things, I'm like that idea of your brain being wired for survival and unfamiliar doesn't mean unsafe. It's like, who's responsible for teaching these things? Like, these seem like basics of like, Bradley, you are a man of the academic institution. Like, who is responsible? Because some of it is like, is this our job? Is this what we're here for? Surrender? Yeah.
Which is why there's a need for explicit teaching and training about it.
Sure. Yeah.
So wrapping up, if you had to leave the listeners of this episode with anything, what would be your final words? What would be something that, principle or a lesson or an observation that you think would be useful for people to take with them? So if we were to distill the wisdom of Eileen down into droplets, what would be some that you would share?
We didn't get deep into, we sort of scratched the surface of spirituality, and I think it's kind of the root of everything. Mm-hmm. And for me, things really changed when the transformation really took hold and took over and offered force and energy and light and guidance beyond what I could have ever even imagined possible, when I let go of thinking it was just me in this human physical form walking on this earth, and really realized that there was a source connection that was available to me to access as a co-creator, as a support mechanism, as a guide, as a teacher, as a place to go, and as a place to create from. And so whatever that looks like for you, I talk in my book about it being an unlimited source. And for me, it's become God over time. But I think of any source that comes from unseen energy and moves you. So that could be whomever you feel or see or know to be your guardian angel. It could be music. There are so many different sources of energy that move you, that whatever makes you feel unlimited is potentially yours if you've yet to identify it. if you're going through something or want to go through something or are seeking ways to live more purposefully or truthfully or as your authentic self, then co-creating with that source of energy will change everything.
Well said. Thank you for being on this episode or this podcast, and thank you for helping me relaunch the podcast.
It was my pleasure.
How can people get a hold of you? How can they learn about the work you're doing and connect with you online?
Well, you can find me at Eileen L. Crossin on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn. You can look for my business, Get Quantum Potential, online, also on Instagram, also on LinkedIn. And my book, Unrealized, is coming out in December. Fingers crossed, I hope. So you can look for me on the bookshelf.
That sounds great. And we'll have links to all of those in the show notes. Thank you so much, Eileen.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Second Calling podcast. If you want to keep on thinking about purpose and work and what comes next in life, you might want to subscribe to my monthly newsletter. Every issue gives you a story, an idea, and a next step that you can try yourself. You can find it and more about my work at my website, bradleywrightphd.com. I'll put the link in the show notes. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time.